Now it's time to pour the epoxy. Or is it? There's a couple of problems we ran into when we poured ours. First problem, when you pour the epoxy, the boards actually want to float up. So you need to clamp those boards down. To make that easier, we simply put a couple spacers underneath the mold. The second problem we had is that the mold wasn't level. So when we poured the epoxy, it actually puddled up at one end. To remedy that, we put a couple washers underneath the spacers on one end. Then we checked the mold for level and we were good to go. EcoPoxy comes in a two-part system. You'll get the resin and the hardener. These are actually mixed in a 2-to-1 ratio. Along with the resin and the hardener, you'll also get solid color dyes. Now this is a good way to add color to the epoxy since the epoxy is clear. These dyes come in a variety of sizes and colors. We used blue as the main component in our river, but we also added just a little bit of white, which provided some really nice swirls along the edges. There's also metallics that you can add to the epoxy. Now while this won't add a lot of color, it does add a little shimmer to your river. Although we didn't use it in our river table, you can also get glitter. It comes in a variety of colors as well. One of the advantages of EcoPoxy is that it takes up to 3 days to dry, which means it stays cooler, which allows you to pour up to 1.5 inches thick at a time. As compared to EcoPoxy, regular epoxy begins to set in 2 to 3 hours. It generates way too much heat to do a thick pour. EcoPoxy is also crystal clear and bubble free. The next step is to figure out how much epoxy we need. To do that, lay the boards on the bench to the finished width. Then take 4 to 5 measurements along the river area. This will give you an average width. Then measure the length of the workpiece and also measure the depth. Now take the average width times the length times the depth, and this will give you cubic inches. Then take the cubic inches and convert that to liters. An easy way to do that is simply go to Google and use one of their conversion calculators. Before you mix the epoxy for your project, we suggest doing some test samples. Now here's a good example with this small bucket of the color that we actually got with our project. You can see the metallics sort of in the top, a little bit of the blue towards the bottom, and then you'll also see that the white actually sank to the bottom. We'll get to more on that later. When we mixed up the large bucket, it actually became a better representation of what our actual table looked like. So make sure and take the time and do a little experimenting. Try a little bit of dye, try a little bit of metallic, and see what you get first. Let's get started with the pour. First, place the 2 boards inside the mold. Although our video doesn't show clamps, at this point you'll want to clamp those boards down, otherwise they'll float once you pour the epoxy. I added clamping pads covered in blue tape so the epoxy wouldn't stick to the clamps. To mix the epoxy, we first pour in the resin. Then pour in the hardener at a 2-to-1 ratio. Using a paint stick, stir the resin and hardener together. Make sure you mix thoroughly. I would recommend at least 4 to 5 minutes if you're mixing it by hand. To speed that up, you can get attachments for your drill. Once that's done, it's time to add metallic. We added the metallic before the blue pigment because the metallic will add some color to the clear epoxy. After that's been mixed in, add a few drops of the blue dye. Now you see the color really start to appear. Now we're ready to pour the EcoPoxy. Start at one end and work your way towards the other end as you pour. It's better to over pour than under pour because you don't want to end up with low spots, which will lead to more sanding. When we poured ours, we were just a little bit shy of the top of the surface. No worries, just mix up another small batch of EcoPoxy. We did do something different when we mixed the second batch. We didn't add any solid color dye, we just used the metallic. Once that's done, we actually poured it right down the middle of the river. After you pour, do a visual check to make sure it's level. If you see pooling at one end, you'll need to shim it up slightly. We decided to add just a little more character to our river. To simulate the look of rapids along the river edge, we added some white pigment in a few locations. Note that the drops sank instantly to the bottom. If that happens, take a small dowel, like an 1/8 inch dowel, and swirl it up to the top of the surface. We kept an eye on our project for the first 2 to 3 hours to make sure all the air bubbles rise to the surface. If air bubbles are a problem with your project, you'll want to take a heat gun to the top of it. We didn't need to do this step, as all the bubbles that were trapped inside the EcoPoxy rose to the top of the surface within 2 to 3 hours. It's a good time to do a visual check around all the joints to make sure that there's no leakage. If there happens to be a leak, don't be afraid to whip out the tape and patch it up. Now it's time to leave it alone.